Appreciate it. First thing I want to do is show our gratitude as an audience for the people who put on the conference here. It's not really their day jobs, and it's kind of like putting on like 3 or 4 weddings all at once. So I really want to appreciate them for all their work. My name is Zach Nies, Chief Technologist at Rally. I also teach entrepreneurship at the University of Colorado, part of the faculty there. And it's a great kind of way to blend a lot of the research and pragmatic stuff that I do in industry sort of to the next generation. And a lot of what I'll talk about today, trying to inspire that within the generation of engineers that's coming up next. I want to challenge you today with one thing, which is to remain competitive. I think you need to extend agility beyond your development teams. Now you may think of that, what, extend agility? We're just getting started, or we're doing this really well at scale. How could we possibly extend it past that? Or you may be thinking, well, we own our little corner of agility. We can't really go past that very much. I'm going to challenge you on that today and say you can move past that. And it's actually really important to the competitiveness of the company that you're in. I'm going to give you an example here of what can happen in a marketplace. This is a consumer data company. And the timeline here is, if you kind of roll this back a little bit, what you see is in green will be desktop usage of their products. In red, you'll see mobile usage here. And that green extends back about 3 or 4 years. So they had about 80% market dominance in their market for about 4 years up to this point. What they saw was, with the introduction of the iPhone and especially the iPad and other tablets, they started seeing a lot of the usage of their application move off the desktop and move on to mobile. So it started to emerge. And in sort of early 2012, they said, we need some type of native presence on that platform to remain competitive. Roll the clock forward a quarter, and they begin specification at a high level of what that native application is going to be. A quarter later, a startup competitor in the space ships a native-only application. So they go first to mobile with their business. And we're seeing here now the larger incumbent here, their usage and their market share is still pretty dominant, still hanging right there at 80%. But what they're seeing is the desktop, which has been the lifeblood of where they've had their application and their value, is starting to decline. Half a year later, startup competitor ships their next major revision. So they've been shipping all along, but they have a major market event, ship their product. And now the incumbent is starting to see a little bit of their market share decline. A quarter later, app development begins. So they're done with the specification. The incumbent begins development on this application. Startup competitor, a quarter later, ships another major version, their third major version in the marketplace. The incumbent starts to see their value in the marketplace decline. Almost a full year after development, the incumbent ships their native application. And if we look at this timeline here, we see some kind of important things, which is it took them about 12 months to write that specification. From the time they identified the business threat and opportunity to actually when they knew what they were going to develop. And to actually build that native app took them almost another year. So we've got 21 months from first kind of inkling that there's a problem in the marketplace or a shift happening to when they actually responded to it. The important thing here is that it took 12 months for this company to forever lose more than half their market share in the marketplace, never getting it back. And if you're a technology executive or part of the executive team of this company, it's just gut-wrenching to go through that experience and realize all this work we've spent the last 7, 8 years building in the marketplace just disappeared in a month or in a year. Well, what's going on here? What are the trends that are enabling this? Why is this happening more and more often? If you think of product development, kind of the simplest way I can summarize it is there's 5 key axes that are essential to hitting a product that really has force in the marketplace. It has to be desirable. People have to want it, and it solves a problem that they have. There's technological feasibility. Can you actually build the thing to the level that the customers will need? Is there business viability around that? Can you spread it, meaning that I'll recommend it to a friend because that helps my social capital, as well as they get value out of it and I get more value out of it? And then is it sustainable? Can they sustain the development of this over time? And products that hit that sweet spot can rapidly change markets. So that's one dynamic of product development that we're seeing. The other thing is that the tribes in which we release our products are highly connected. It used to be, it would take a long time for something, once it hit that sweet spot of kind of maximizing the 5 axes there, to spread throughout a tribe and a marketplace. Today now we have near perfect efficiency of information in those marketplaces. Ideas and concepts spread very rapidly. So once a product finds that spot, it goes whoosh in the marketplace and radically changes the expectations around it. So let's look at some examples here of the time needed to reach this kind of one magical spot of this, of feasibility, desirability, and viability, to the point where it can spread through a marketplace. Back in 1984, Apple released the first Macintosh. Roll the clock forward to 2006, that's where they got kind of all those axes really well defined, to the point where it was now defining what was expected in the marketplace for all-in-one computers as well as OS X, in what it meant to have a really modern operating system. My grandmother had one, and our developers were writing all of our software on these. So it took about 20 years to fundamentally shift expectations around computers. 2001, Apple releases the iPod, not the first MP3 player. By 2006, they'd got that magical combination right, where anyone wanted it, super desirable, replacing all the existing technology that was out there, very spreadable. 5 years. So we see a compression of 20 years down to 5 years to shift the computer market and then the music marketplace. 2007, iPhone 1 released. 2010, the iPhone 4 is released. And at this moment, it radically changes what people expect of how they interact with computers, how they interact with information online. That took them 3 years to fundamentally shift that expectations in that marketplace. 2010, the original iPad is released. 2012, the iPad 3. Fundamentally changes the expectation of what does it mean to use a computer when you're not at work. That took 2 years for that to ripple throughout the marketplace. You may think, okay, Apple's just got good at this. They got really good at their supply chain over time. Now let's look at cars. So this is Elon Musk with Tesla Roadster #1 coming off the production line in 2008. By 2012, people I know who have Tesla Roadsters say that it really changed the expectation for what it means to have a high-performance Roadster. That took 4 years. We're talking about an entirely new car platform in 4 years, shifting market expectations. Tesla, the Model S, I don't know how you count this. I'm an engineer, so I'll start with 0 here and say this took 0 years. Fundamentally shifting what's expected out of high-performance luxury sedans with their first introduction in the marketplace. And you see this rippling throughout all the other luxury automakers. Let's now talk about social networks and connected tribes. 1979, CompuServe comes on the market, starts defining what does it mean to have a social network and connect with people online. By 1989, the concept had really shifted that, yeah, that was how people get together, is through an online environment like that. So that took 10 years to establish that and change the expectations in the marketplace. LinkedIn did it in the professional networking marketplace in about 5 years. Yammer, inside the corporate intranet, did it in about 2.5 years. In the consumer space, Instagram did it in about 1.5 years. Fundamental change of what it means to take a picture and share it online radically changed in 1.5 years. Sound of Music, which in 1966 opened up their first big box retail, which we now know as Best Buy. And in 1998, by 1998, Best Buy had really set the market expectation of what does it mean to walk into a store and buy just about any piece of electronics you want nationwide. That took them 30 years to get to that point. If we think about Amazon, 1998, they began selling more than just books. And with Amazon Prime, fundamentally changed what people expect for shipment of products and being able to buy online. I know now if I can't get something for free in 2 days when I buy it online, I get really frustrated. Totally changed my expectation for what it means to buy online. And that took about 7 years. So what we're seeing as another dynamic is the time needed for a tribe to form and spread the word is also changing. So let's look at an example here. Ford Pinto. They had a little bit of a problem in quality at one point. And it took about 8 years for the information to spread that that problem existed to the point where Ford acknowledged it and did something about it. Toyota had another similar sort of thing happen with their gas pedals and their floor mats. But today, that tribe only took about 1.5 years for that information to spread so wildly, Toyota had to do something about that. So that's an example of the difference in how information is spreading. So these market expectations can change and spread very quickly. And if you're an incumbent and you're in an entrenched environment and in a marketplace, That can all change around you very quickly. So we have to think about how do we have the agility to balance two main things? Because you have to continue to operate your business, the business that's making you all the money. And how do you balance that with responding to changes and shifts in the marketplace? And that can feel pretty unnatural to do. Let's look at why. Fred Taylor, about 100 years ago, wrote a very important piece, Scientific Management. It was a very important piece of management science at the time. I think it's important, though, to look at the history of it and the context of it. So it was all around this key idea of getting greater efficiency as a nation, and more specifically, greater efficiency out of individuals. How can we get our largest daily output for all the individuals working? The context is very different, though, than the context we live in today, because he was talking about moving 90-pound blocks of iron, lathing metal, and women and school children inspecting ball bearings. In that context, this made a lot of sense to approach management this way. But I don't know about you, but I don't fortunately move 90-pound blocks of iron, and I don't inspect ball bearings. So the context of how we work today is different. This old context of scientific management assumes that certainty is high, and that we're trying to maximize individual efficiency. Roll the clock 100 years forward, and how do we see that materializing in our businesses today? We tend to see these top-down status quo budgets, where you get the budget from last year, and then you have this sort of zero-sum game fight to tweak it a little bit. That moves down into comprehensive analysis. Given that budget, what can we predict, analyze, and hit for a few years out? That gets turned into detailed planning, very systematic plans. We're going to do this on this day, that on that day, that on that day. And then from an execution standpoint, those big batches end up getting executed kind of stage by stage through a waterfall execution process. This works when certainty is high, when there are very few shifts going on in the marketplace and there's a high degree of order and predictability. But I ask you the question, is your business getting more certain? Do you see the trend flowing toward more certainty in your marketplace? Generally not. What we need to do is now combine a couple of concepts, agile execution and lean thinking. How can we combine those to extend agility outside of the development team and make it useful into the entire company? Because that'll allow us to balance operating our business today, because that's essential for the cash flow and the future of the business, and also exploring our way to viable opportunities in the future. Explore our way into the answer of how are we going to turn these threats, these disruptions, into opportunities. This approach assumes uncertainty exists, and our goal is to maximize value delivery, not individual efficiency. And we look at it from this model. We say, instead of the status quo budgeting, what we need at the high levels of the company is we need adaptive steering. Instead of that comprehensive planning, we need a way of being disciplined explorers and exploring our way to these options in the future. That's fueled, instead of by detailed planning, a process of empirical learning, where we systematically learn our way to what's going to work in the marketplace. And we replace waterfall execution with agile execution. So the title is 3 steps here. I'm a trained engineer, so I'll start out counting from 0. What we need to do really to accomplish this is replace waterfall execution with agile execution. We need to move from this big batch mindset of moving this sort of maximum amount of work we can with no feedback from stage to stage to a very iterative and incremental process. That's kind of a key metabolic thing we have to do as a company to be able to take advantage of these other strategies. I think it's important, too, to think about waterfall. I mean, this is the diagram we all know. It looks like this because that's about all the topography they could do back in the 50s when it was written. This is actually what was documented, if you look deeper into it, which was a very, actually, iterative process. So baked into waterfall is this notion of iteration. The one downside it had, though, was the primary feedback mechanism was documentation, not working software. So that's a big change that we've made in the change of methodologies. Pick your favorite flavor. You can approach it from a Scrum standpoint. You can approach it from a Kanban standpoint. The key thing is you have some type of execution process that can work on very small batches, and it's optimized for feedback. All right, step 1. We need to now move up and talk about balancing this notion of planning with empirical learning. So I'm not saying replace it, because each has its own place where it works well. I'm going to focus on kind of how this sometimes goes a little bit wrong. Often when we want to approach learning about something, we start out with a plan. And we create this plan to help predict the future. And it generally goes something like this. We go through a budgetary approval cycle. We do a bunch of market research. We get down to the project definition. Then we think about the detailed requirements, exactly what are we going to build. That falls into a detailed engineering plan. We go into development on that, and then verification. Final release, either internally or externally then. If you think about, though, in that whole process, how many guesses did you make in that whole plan of events? And then you have this sort of magical moment where it comes into first contact with users. And usually it goes something like this in my experience. Just because we can, let's look at it from the inside here. This is that massive batch of guessing coming into first contact with reality of the marketplace. I don't know about you, but I've had that steering wheel hit me in the chin a couple times where I release something and gets into the marketplace and I realize, oh no, we have built the wrong thing. No one actually wants this. It's a horrible feeling. How many here have gone through a product release that was similar like that? Yeah, quite a few hands. The problem here is that form of planning obscures all that uncertainty with details of a false precision. So what we need is some way to embrace, reveal, and mitigate all of that uncertainty. Effectively move through it in a way that shines light on the things that we don't know. The thing we want to do is turn all that uncertainty into knowledge. Knowledge about what the market wants, knowledge about what's feasible, what's desirable, what's going to be viable, what's sustainable, and what's spreadable. That's the uncertainty we have to tackle. And we have a way of turning that into knowledge. How many of you have done a science fair project or helped somebody with a science fair project? Excellent. You all know how to do this, because this is based on the scientific method. You've got experience. We go through first a preparation process where you review a canvas, enumerate assumptions, identify some key assumptions, and then run multiple experiments on that. So let's zoom in on this a little bit. When we talk about a canvas, these techniques replace the normal kind of business planning process. And you can use a business canvas if most of your uncertainty centers around your business model. You can use initiative or feature canvases if your uncertainty falls more around what are you going to build. You're not actually innovating on your business model, but you're innovating at a feature or a high-level product level. You fill out those canvases just with sticky notes. The idea here is you want to actually invite and celebrate the fact that you don't have all the answers on this canvas. And the expectation is it will change. And because it's written in this format, it doesn't feel like it's cast in stone and nothing will ever change. I encourage teams when they do this when things change, when they learn something and it modifies the canvas, celebrate it. That's exactly what you're supposed to be doing. It's also a great tool for team members, because when you're dealing with a lot of uncertainty, that ambiguity creates a lot of confusion sometimes with the team. You may think one thing, somebody else may think something completely different. You both sort of nod your heads and agree that you both in agreement. These canvases up on walls are a great way to have the team stand back and really understand where they're aligned and where they're not. Next, you enumerate your assumptions. You be honest with yourself and say, here are all the things we're guessing on, or here are all the risks, here are all the things we are assuming. And then there's a way of organizing that to make sure that you pick out the key assumptions, the ones that have a real cascade effect. Once you learn about it, it's going to affect all your other assumptions or have a big impact on your business or your model. Then we go into a process of running multiple experiments where we turn those key assumptions into knowledge. And to run experiments, it first starts out with a frame process. This is where we frame both the problem, our understanding of the problem, and we frame the experiment we're going to run to turn that knowledge into valuable information for us. Einstein knew a thing or two about solving really hard problems, and I really like his concept that the problem and figuring out the problem is more essential sometimes than the solution. How many of you here come from an engineering background, have an engineering degree of some kind? All right, most of the room. You were probably given around 5,000 problems in an undergraduate engineering education. And the game is There's one valid solution to that, and you have to go find it. The tricky thing in business, though, is that we're generally never given a problem with one right solution. The challenge for us is figuring out what's the right problem to solve. What's the valid problem to go figure out? And that starts by having empathy, by interviewing people, getting their stories, talk to them directly, observe them in their environments, really try to get in their shoes, understand what they're experiencing every day. You can do this through story capture, you can do this through empathy maps. The important thing is that you talk to human beings and you document what you heard from them. Then have some way of standing back and seeking insights around that. And our brains have this really cool mechanism called mirror neurons. So if you were to scan somebody having a direct experience, their brain lights up in the green there. And you hearing about that story, if your brain was being scanned, you would see that it's lighting up in very similar ways. So our brains are built to connect at this level and really understand what people are going through. The key then to problem solving, though, is to bring your own insights into that. It's important to know what the person's experiencing, but you have a lot of valuable knowledge too and hunches that then you can blend with that, your insights, and from that comes a framed problem that then you can run an experiment on. Let's look at an example here. A group of students from Stanford's design school were given the challenge that babies were needlessly dying in Nepal. They immediately jumped, as good engineers do, to the assumption, well, it's probably because the incubators are too expensive or broken in Nepal. They probably just can't afford them. So instead of just assuming that and building a cheaper incubator, they got an airplane, went over to Nepal, walked around the hospital, and they saw a row of perfectly functional incubators, but no babies in them. They interviewed some of the doctors, and they said, well, why, what's up with the incubators that are all empty? And the doctor said, well, the babies never actually make it here. They die out in the field hours away from the hospital. So the students, rather than just taking that on face value, they said, okay, great, let's go hours out away from the hospital and figure out what's going on. And they realized the problem actually was not a cheaper incubator. The problem was keeping babies warm out in the field for the few hours it would take them to get to the hospital. Once the problem was framed that way, they designed this roughly $10 sleeping bag for the babies that was a warmer. So it allowed you to put a little gel pack in there, keep the babies warm for 3-4 hours with the simple tools they have out in the field. And this has saved about 300,000 babies, the simple reframing of the problem. The other thing that we want to talk about here is framing the experiment. So now that we've framed the problem, how do we frame the experiment in a way that we can learn from it? A key part here is to think about what do you want to learn and why. What's your hypothesis that you want to test? What materials and methods are you going to follow? And then what variables and measures are you going to pay attention to? There's another important aspect of framing an experiment. When you do this in a larger corporation, there's this thing called the corporate immune system. These white blood cells come out and generally say, you can't do that. It's very important to consider the safety of your experiments. And safety is defined as making sure that it doesn't blow up in your environment and cause damage to the company. It doesn't mean that you always get an expected result. So safety is do no harm. Then we move to build. Once we understand the problem we want to solve and how we're going to run an experiment to gain that knowledge, then we go into building. And this is where having that high metabolism, high feedback method of execution is important. Either Scrum, Kanban, pick your low batch size methodology of choice. Next piece of this is to measure. And that first involves collecting data. And I bring this up because it's important when you're building first, as you're building and designing what you're going to build for your experiment, think about you're going to be collecting data. Most of the times we build things, and after the fact we realize, it'd be nice to have that data, but we never actually proactively build into our backlogs that we need to actually have some infrastructure to collect that data. Once you have the data, then you need to be able to turn it into information and meaning. And then you have to organize it. Because if you can't organize it in such a way that you can share it and tell a story around it, you won't be able to learn from it. And our final piece here is learn. Our brains have this really kind of cool and important bias called hindsight bias. Sometimes it's called retrospective coherence. It basically says that our brains, when we see something happen, our brains naturally look at that and go, yeah, that's about what I expected to happen. The challenge is that learning sits at this gap between what we expect will happen and what actually happens. And if you don't write down what you expect will happen, your brain will rob you from the surprise of the difference, and you won't actually learn from it. So that's why we frame the experiment. We want to make sure, even if it's just on a sticky note, You don't have to do anything super formal, but you have to be able to go back to it and learn from it. Once the experiment concludes, then you need some way to organize that information and share it, because knowledge gained that isn't shared is really of no value. So you've got to write down your experiment results, compare it up with your hypothesis. What did you learn? What was the validated learnings from that? Also, I encourage teams to think about your ancillary insights. A lot of the innovations that we all use today, many of them came from sort of happy accidents. The joke is when a scientist goes, I wonder why that happened. Usually there's innovation somewhere in there, and you should go digging for it. Next steps, given that knowledge, what is it appropriate to do next? And because you're spending money to learn here, we want to make sure that we have some way of accounting for, did you validate your hypothesis? Did you invalidate it? Or they're really ugly and inconclusive? And it's important to think about your cycle time. How fast did it take you to learn that knowledge, and how much money did you burn while you did that? Because the goal here is you're turning money into knowledge. You're buying knowledge about some piece of uncertainty that's critical to your environment. So you want to make sure you're very effective about doing that. An example here of why it's important to write things down. Let's say that you're running an experiment and you expect about 25% activation of new users through this feature. You run the experiment, you get the data, and the answer is you got 55% activated. Now, if you didn't write it down, hindsight and bias would go, oh yeah, that's about what I expected. And you'd miss the opportunity to ask yourself and the team, why is it we got a result that was 2x what we expected to get? And in there will be knowledge. Even though it's a great result, the surprise around that should be revealed and talked about. That's the process of empirical learning. That's the next step up from Agile execution. It's also important to think about, as you're running these experiments, about half the time, our goal is to increase our knowledge here, half the time you should get a result that you didn't expect. Now, this isn't getting a result that causes damage or blows something up, but half the time you should be looking and go, I wasn't expecting that result. If you are 100% of the time getting a result you expect, you're basically wasting a bunch of money through an elaborate process to prove to yourself what you already know. And that generally indicates you don't have enough safety around you to admit that you're going to push yourself and get an unexpected result. And if you're never getting an expected result, that means that you need more empathy. You're running experiments that are too far off of where they should be. Let's listen to advice real quick here from a master. Richard Feynman's one of my intellectual heroes, certainly knows a thing or two about the scientific method. Let's talk about how he thinks of science.
Now I'm going to discuss how we would look for a new law. In general, we look for a new law by the following process. First, we guess it. Then we well, don't laugh, that's really true. Then we compute the consequences of the guess to see if this is right, if this law that we guessed is right, we see what it would imply. And then we compare those computation results to nature, or we say compare to experiment or experience. Compare it directly with observation to see if it works. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. In that simple statement is the key to science. It doesn't make a difference how beautiful your guess is. It doesn't make a difference how smart you are who made the guess or what his name is. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. That's all there is to it.
Now, in Feynman's environment, he's working with famous scientists sometimes, and he says a statement in there of, it doesn't matter who your name is. And often in science, there's this notion of, if you have a unit named after you, your guess is going to be way better than anybody else's. But what he's saying about the scientific method is that all gets democratized. If it doesn't match up with the empirical results, then your guess was wrong. And that can have a huge impact, too, in incumbent companies, where based on titles, the same thing happens. The higher the title, the better your guess is. The great thing about an experiment is it can democratize that and make it all about the data. All right, step 2 is we need to balance analysis with disciplined exploration. Disciplined exploration is this process of looking for opportunities or responding to threats in the marketplace where you don't really know the end result of where that product's going to be or what's going to be the compelling product in the marketplace. So this is a way, I talked originally about those kind of 5 axes of finding that magic spot where the product goes whoosh and people really want it and use it and it's viable. This is an approach to getting there. First, it starts off with a team. So keep in mind we're talking about innovative new things. We're talking about sort of an explorer team that's away from the operating side of the company. First, we form that team. The team starts out of, do we have strong conviction to make this vision come true? So you have to form a small band of pirates, just like you would in a startup, to say, these people really want to see this change happen in the marketplace. And if they don't do it, no one else is going to do it. They have the deepest conviction we can find around this. Then you think of a vision. What do you want to go tackle in the marketplace? And that vision's got to be big enough that it has the potential to change the markets around it. So you want to find one of those magical products that can go whoosh through a marketplace. And really important is the next step of creating a sandbox, a safe sandbox in which this team can operate. Because you're going to be doing processes, you're going to be exploring in a way that the operating side of the company may not understand or appreciate. Then we move into disciplined exploration. So once we have that team, we need to now go and discover what's out there. First part of that is the problem. We need to discover that we understand what a customer wants solved. What's this pain, what's the ache that they want to make go away in the marketplace? The solution then, we need to discover, can we actually build something that solves that customer problem? And these are all iterative because often as you build a solution, offer it up to a potential customer, they're going to comment on it. And in that, you and they are going to learn more about their problem and what actually is part of their problem. And so we need to know, can we see that this potentially solves that customer's problem? And we've got to have an understanding of the viability of our business. Can we actually make something that's viable for our business and can have an impact in the marketplace? Once we cycle through this and get to the point where we're confident that we know the answers to these, then we ask ourselves a pivot or persevere question. And this is a key kind of checkpoint in this process to make sure we don't get too far along. This is where we buy feedback, we buy information about next steps. A pivot is probably one of the most overused words now in entrepreneurship, but what it means is you've got a vision, you know where you're going. A pivot is where you keep one foot firmly grounded in your knowledge, all that empirical learning that you had. And you move one foot over and you say, okay, there's a key hypothesis that we think we got wrong, and we have to change that key hypothesis. That may be the problem, it may be the solution, it may be an aspect of the business model. And we move our direction. If we say persevere, we're saying, yeah, we've gone through this exploration process, we've discovered something that we think is really viable in the marketplace, a problem that's really worth solving, that we can make money from as a business. Now let's move forward and add more information to that. The next piece is to validate your knowledge around that. Once you've discovered that opportunity, validate that you can actually turn a business into it. The first piece of this is, can you actually sell it? And this starts with, metaphorically, the founders. The people on your team that can sell anything to anybody, convince anybody to do anything, those people need to go out and start selling this. Because if they can't sell it, nobody else is going to be able to. Because they're the ones with the biggest reality distortion field around them. Once they're able to do that systematically over time, the next piece is to help learn how to do that for other people. So this could be activating users if you're in a web and mobile environment. It could be direct channel sales if you're more of an enterprise environment. But you've got to be able to take that sort of magical distortion field that those founders can create around them as they're selling things and systematize it. Figure out how can you write a playbook that a salesperson can grab and execute on and close those sales over time. The next is that we understand how we're actually going to take this to market. What's our go-to-market strategy of getting this in front of customers, positioning it, talking about it, framing it in a way that our customers are going to understand and be able to relate to. Then we go through another pivot or persevere meeting where we ask ourselves, okay, do we have proof and evidence that this is going to work in the marketplace? If we don't, then we invite ourselves to pivot, either do more validation or say, oh, this just isn't the right answer. We got to go all the way back and begin our initial discovery work. We stay together as a team, but we do more discovery. If we say persevere, all the evidence shows that there's a viable business here. Then we move on to transition. Now, normally in startup land, you would say, okay, scale up, just scale up. But for incumbents doing this type of disciplined exploration, now you need to be able to take this product that's now working in a marketplace and effectively move it into the operating side of the company, where you get the economies of scale and where it fits in with the rest of the portfolio of execution there. The first is assembling another team. This is a transition team. It's very similar to what you would do in an acquisition. Do you have a budget, and can you assemble a cross-departmental transition team? People who own the process of taking what these crazy innovators have created and blending it into the operational mindset of the company. Next, we make sure that the departments can begin taking on this work. So the product teams, the engineering teams, the marketing teams, the sales teams, aspects of the channel, can they take this and learn how to integrate it in with their day-to-day activities? And the final piece here is the roll-off. You've got to be able to give those innovators a place either to roll into the departments and continue to see their baby thrive in the marketplace, or roll off and do more innovative things. If your answer is, after the transition, just lay off all the innovators, you basically get one chance to do this. So you've got to create that safe environment for the cyclical activity of innovators to innovate. I'd like to invite us to listen to Ries here talk about this process from his point of view and why it's a little different and essential to do it this way.
Is the problem with the world we live in. Who really feels like the world is getting more and more stable every day? Right? Like, no, it's exactly the opposite. Yep. Our work is moving on a conveyor belt out of the domain of general management and into the domain of entrepreneurial management. So if you think about what's the fundamental cycle time we should be focused on in entrepreneurial management, it's going to be different than in general management. If you look at the lean manufacturing revolution, and lean startup takes its name from lean manufacturing, that system of production that originated in Japan with Toyota Production System, that cycle time was all about how do we eliminate every obstacle between the time a customer gives us their money and the time we have delivered to them a high quality product. And you drive that cycle time down, waste is eliminated, awesome things happen. But that whole system presupposes that you already know who the customer is and they're giving you a bunch of orders. And as you guys know, as entrepreneurs, we often build an amazing product that gets 0 orders total. And so the cycle time of delivering high quality product has nothing to do with these. It's not just completely orthogonal. So we have to focus on a different cycle time. The time between when we have an idea and when we have learned whether that idea is brilliant or crazy.
To me, that's a good summary of what this disciplined exploration is about. A systematic way to figure out if your idea is crazy or if it's viable in the marketplace. Step 3 to extending agility outside of your development team is balancing budgeting with adaptive steering. The typical approach to budgeting is this, what I call budget as a strategy. Well, this is the budget that we have, therefore we're going to figure out how to do our best with it, and that will turn into our strategy. Our CFO has kind of a fun thing that he says, and this is the expectation of the operating side of the company. Plus or minus the price of a Hyundai, how much will you make next year with this spend? Like, he wants to know it down to roughly about $35,000. And that's that operating mindset. Now, in an innovation environment where you're trying to build innovative things, you can't answer that question. So you need another way to kind of, in a culturally appropriate and budgetarily appropriate, sidestep that question. Typically in the past, what we've done with this is we create this, what I'll call the magic box of innovation, where you ask for a bunch of money, throw it into this box, and you hope that some magic comes out the other end. And usually somewhere in there is the phrase, trust us. And sometimes magic happens and it's great, but it's not very predictable from a process standpoint. So what we need to do is we need to create space and safety and accountability for these various teams that are in various states of uncertainty in the marketplace. And a good way to do that is with budgeting horizons. We look now at our budget and we say, okay, there's 3 distinct spots where our budget's going to be different. We've got Horizon 3, that's where all these new products are incubating, new offers are incubating. We've got Horizon 2, where we're going through the transition. And then we've got Horizon 1, which is the operating side of the company. Horizon 3 is all about today's spend is buying us options on future high growth offers. And the expected return on those is about 36 to 72 months. So you've got this horizon in the future, and it's all about buying options. That's what your money's going to. Horizon 2 is about taking today's high growth offers. So they've got a lot of growth to them, but they don't yet have materiality and revenue. So they're not really moving the needle yet. But because of their growth, you can see within 12 to 36 months that they can move the needle. And then you've got the typical budgeting, which is today's spend is funding offers with a predictable return within the current budgetary cycle. And most companies, obviously, if you have this kind of mindset of you've got a product in the marketplace that runs the risk of getting disruption, you're already doing great in Horizon 1. Often companies will have some type of Horizon 3 effort, whether they call it that or not, where they're trickling some kind of money into hackathons or innovation teams or some kind of place to kind of build that popcorn of new options. It's really Horizon 2 that's the challenge. A typical allocation across these horizons will be roughly 70% in Horizon 1. This is kind of a good place to start. 20% in Horizon 2 and 10% in Horizon 3. Now, if you haven't been very effective in Horizon 3, you're not going to have anything to transfer yet. So what we encourage is that 20% goes into Horizon 3. Buy yourself a bunch of options on the future that then the viable ones, the most viable ones, then you can take through this transferring into the operating side of the company. The mindsets are very different here as well. So as we think about these three horizons, Horizon 3 is about you're trying to explore new categories, you're trying to make a name for yourself, you're focusing on what are the potential deal sizes here, can we create some buzz and some PR. In Horizon 2, it's all about, Horizon 2 is kind of this converter from AC current to DC current. It's this place where these two very different worlds combine. And here we're really thinking about time. How fast can we get this thing from this transfer from a high growth to now a material offer in the marketplace? We think a lot about sales velocity, deal size. A lot of the things a startup would think about is they're growing up their sales team or growing up their web distribution channel. And you're really focused on your time to tipping point. How fast can we get this market to tip in our favor? And then Horizon 1 is generally the metrics that we all know and love. And I put this up here to draw the distinction for how in Horizon 1, typically how we think about operating our company and the metrics around that change dramatically into Horizon 2 and then change dramatically again into Horizon 3. It's also important when we're doing this type of work to really be mindful of the flow of information. So we've got our organizational chart there on the left. And what we want to do on a very periodic cadence is we want to make sure that we're flowing information from the ground, the sensors on the ground in the marketplace about what's going up into the marketplace, all the way up into the executive levels and back down and oscillating within management. And that allows these opportunities to emerge from the eyes and ears that are closest to the customers up to the level where the decision makers can control kind of the allocations for the teams. But that as a high level is the stack, the 3 steps to extending agility outside of your development organization. Start out with that agile execution, then move up, think about empirical learning. How can you acknowledge the assumptions that you have in your environment, run experiments to turn those assumptions or risks or guesses into knowledge. Then as you bring new offers to market, think about this disciplined exploration process of systematically taking the uncertainty out of it. And then a level above that, think about how you're budgeting to allow these teams to exist. Another thing to keep in mind with this is the technology adoption. We're here about building technology and we're building it for people. I think technology adoption is a human phenomenon. Very often, especially as an engineer, I often thought, well, if I just build this magical thing, everybody will want it. But there are very characteristic things as human beings we do as we're adopting technology. I'm going to give you an example here. This is from a music festival a few years ago. The music in the background is the technology being adopted. So think about that as the technology adoption. And what we have here is one crazy lone innovator adopting this technology. Standing out there alone, as most first innovators are. The world kind of looking at him like, it's kind of odd. And also, he's not actually particularly good at adopting this technology, but he's got a lot of spirit. And now he's got a friend, another lone innovator out there somewhat poorly adopting this technology. And we see others walking by, looking at him. I don't know about you, but what are you feeling right now for these two? Do you feel a little awkward for them? That maybe they're not behaving in a socially kind of acceptable way in this environment, even though it's music? Also note how long these two crazy people are out here. They're out there awkwardly dancing for quite a long period of time. Now we have another third adopter come in, another crazy early adopter, innovator. Again, not particularly adopting this technology all that well. Gal stands up and is like, I'm not having any of that, sits back down. So she's not ready to adopt this technology yet. And then soon we start getting a few others in here. So now we've got 5, now we have about 8. And think about how rapidly now this tribe starts moving in, and you can't even see the original innovators anymore. They're not really even part of the picture. And now we've moved into the early adopters. Moving in, adopting this technology. We still have a lot of people sitting down, but soon we get to this point where Jeffrey Moore calls the tornado, where is it more awkward to be sitting on the ground or more awkward to be up dancing? And the point where it crosses over to be more awkward to be sitting, that's when we get these mass technology adoptions. At this point, when we have a tribe this big, usually the product, the service starts showing up in the media. Everybody's like, where did this come from? This came out of nowhere. The reality is there were crazy innovators for quite a long time adopting this technology before the mass tribe shows up. And now we have people who really probably don't even care that much about the music, or just getting up to be part of the tribe. And at the very end here, we have my favorite group, the laggards. After the music stops, they're still coming in to be part of that tribe. There's not even any technology to adopt anymore. But it's all now about the human side of being part of this tribe. It's important to keep in mind that the technology that we build, the products that we offer into the marketplace, the humans involved in that will respond very much like this tribe did to this music. This is how humans adopt something new, and how we congregate together and we spread the word around that. I encourage you to think about how you can apply these techniques and think about an agile and human-centered approach to how you develop your products. And balance the execution that you're all well known for with exploration. So how can you operate your company well and explore? Thank you very much.